Austin. Welcome to Rock Book Show, and thank you so much for being here. This is Jesse Jarnow.
Hey, thanks. Thanks for having me.
Well, it is our pleasure. Jesse is the author of Big Day Coming. It is about Yo La Tengo, but it's a lot about indie rock as well, and the history of indie rock. A lot of stuff about Maxwell's, a favorite club, if you just hit the PATH train down here a few blocks and go out to Hoboken. So, Jesse, I have to actually ask you right from the beginning. So why did you write the book? Where did the idea come from?
Well, I guess the reason I wrote the book is I moved to New York a little over 10 years ago and became a music writer. And I'd listened to Yo La Tengo in college a bunch, you know, like a lot of people. And not long after I moved here, I got an assignment to write about them. And, you know, I'd been into their music for a while, and just listening to it for that assignment, it gave me a reason to just keep going deeper and deeper into their catalog. And the deeper I went, it just seemed like the more there was to discover. You know, it's like I could listen to an album and it would be like, oh, there's an EP that goes along with this album that has these covers on it. Oh, and they do these Hanukkah shows where they play 8 nights in a row and have, you know, Ray Davies or David Byrne or these stand-up comedians play with them. And it was just this process of discovery that kind of never really stopped. And the longer I went, the bigger Yo La Tengo fan I became, to the point where I would kind of like scam these assignments where it would be like, hey, can I go cover 8 nights of Yo La Tengo and at Maxwell's? And would find a reason to go see all 8 nights of Hanukkah at Maxwell's. And that kind of, just the more I learned, the bigger their story seemed to me. And then eventually it was like, oh, to really like understand this story, I kind of have to understand, you know, the history of Matador Records or the history of Maxwell's, which were all things I didn't really know when I became a Yo La Tengo fan. So I kind of came in from the outside. And again, the more I found out, the more I found out there was to find out. And then that kind of eventually turned into a book proposal and eventually a book.
Yeah, and you get that through the book too, your enthusiasm for what you're writing about, you know. And it's not just a fawning thing. There really is this genuine amazingness about Hoboken and Yo La Tengo and the history of indie rock. Now, one thing you did say that I wanted to go back to is all the recordings and things that you listened to. You listened to over 500 rare recordings to this.
Right.
Did you find any new personal favorites?
Oh, tons and tons. Yeah, so when I started one of the first things I did was contact this guy who ran this website called Sunsquashed, which was like a bootleg collection. And all the website was his tape list and the set lists. And, you know, I would stare at it sometimes. Oh, man, I wish I could hear that one and that one. So as soon as the book deal came through, I contacted him, and he thankfully sent it all to me on a hard drive. So as I was writing, I went through it, and yeah, I mean, their set lists just change so constantly, and they'll be like, one night they'll be playing like this kind of, you know, acoustic jangle pop, and the next night it'll be noise rock with, you know, feedback and improvisation. So yeah, I mean, I would find things like, you know, random Bob Dylan covers that they only ever did one time, or there are a couple of songs that they have like completely different arrangements of. There's like 7 different versions of Speeding Motorcycle, and like 5 or 6 different versions of Big Day Coming, which is the title track, where, you know, one will be half an hour long and filled with kind of this really slow rolling guitar part. Another one will be this insane feedback rock version. So it was like, it wasn't even, you know, it wasn't like listening to the same show over and over again. It was like finding kind of like whole new albums every day that I went through them.
And they are such an original band, but they are this crazy prolific cover band. It's so cool.
Yeah, I mean, that's again part of the process of discovery, because it's not like, you know, lots of bands will cover something, you know, All Along the Watchtower or something like that, but Yo La Tengo's covers just tend to go just way deeper than that. They'll cover the B-sides, they'll cover, you know, the outtakes, they'll cover, you know, they'll cover random songs from EPs by bands I've never heard of. So it was really just an excuse to kind of dig into all this great music that I didn't really know. Some of it I did.
Well, that's good news. And let's go back to Hoboken for a minute, because here's Hoboken, this great town, of course, famous for Frank Sinatra, then famous for the 80s. You had the bongos out of there, and Yo La Tengo and all those good guys. Maxwell's, an amazing club, still in existence today. What is it about Hoboken?
Well, you know, Hoboken is close to Manhattan without being Manhattan. It is always going to be somewhat culturally removed. Like you said before, you have to get on the PATH train to get there. You have to go under the river. You know, which you have to do to go to Brooklyn as well, but it's a completely different train system to get to New Jersey, which I think adds like a very different vibe to it. And it's a little slower than Manhattan, and it feels a little bit more like a small town. And, you know, every few years there is kind of a rediscovery of Hoboken, like, oh, cheap rents, rock bands moving to Hoboken. But I don't think Hoboken will ever possibly blow up the way Brooklyn has, just because it's Hoboken, because it's, you know, it's over there. And I think that lends itself to kind of this slowness that really allowed Yo La Tengo to develop their voice in the way that they did, that they wouldn't have been able to if they were living in kind of like, you know, the East Village, which is kind of this crazy, you know, meat market, you know, fashion runway.
And two other bands that are pretty in the book quite a bit are the Feelies, who actually, I did not know this, and a couple people I told this to did not know that the Hanukkah show came out of the Feelies, what do I say, blueprint.
Yeah, the Feelies, in the late 70s and early 80s, they, you know, they're not the most gig-happy band that ever existed. They like to really make it an occasion when they play. Their preference is kind of just hang out in their basement and make music for the fun of it. So they really had to kind of like make excuses to get themselves out to play. And Maxwell's was kind of a really special place for them and a lot of bands, because it's got this really unique vibe. It's, you know, it like I said, it doesn't have that sort of the meat market feel of a lot of New York clubs. So they kind of started making this joke like, oh, we're going to only play on holidays. And the joke kind of turned into this real thing where they would play on the 4th of July, or they would play around Thanksgiving, or they would play these different holidays, and it turned into an annual thing. And as it turned out, that was where Georgia and Ira first met, or first talked to each other, was at one of those Feely shows at Maxwell's in 1980, I think. And you know, 10 or so years later, Ira was kind of like riffing off of ideas about, you know, the idea of doing a holiday show, and sort of, you know, parodying the idea of the Feelies playing on the 4th of July. I said, oh, well, the Feelies had the 4th of July, we'll take Hanukkah. And that turned into 8 nights of Hanukkah, which is really a really wonderful, special thing. And I encourage everybody to check it out if they're ever in Hoboken.
It's an amazing gig, and the T-shirts that you can get every year as well. The Paul Stanley one is a favorite around our place. And let's talk about the DBs. They are actually one of my all-time favorite bands. I was lucky enough to see them in a small club in upstate New York, and they kind of changed my life.
Right. Well, the DBs were a big influence on Yo La Tengo musically, but they were also they were friends with Yo La Tengo. Before he was a musician, Ira Kaplan, the guitarist in Yo La Tengo, was a rock journalist, and he worked at this place, New York Rocker, which was based downtown across from the Flatiron Building. And the DBs were kind of the house band there. They practiced in the back of the office, and Peter Holtzapfel, one of the guitarists, even lived there for a while. Like he'd crash on the office couch. And they became this really important part of Ira and George's lives early on, and they encouraged them to make music before they had even picked up instruments. Peter Holtzapfel especially encouraged them to make music, and the first time they ever played in public, relatively speaking, was a party at the New York Rocker office, because Peter had encouraged them to do that. It was a birthday party for somebody else who worked there. And just over the course of the next 10 years, and even ongoing still, the DBs have just been kind of an important part of Yo La Tengo's extended musical family. All of them have played important and very different roles in Yo La Tengo's musical lives. Gene Holder, their bassist, was their producer for a while. Will Rigby, their drummer, was very close with them. And for a brief period, George and I ran a record label called Egon Records, and one of the things they put out was Will's great and very underrated solo album, Sidekick Phenomenon. Chris Stamey was played with Yo La Tengo numerous times. Even just in London this past weekend, he was organizing an Alex Chilton tribute, a Big Star tribute that Ira participated in. So they're still very, very close. And the DBs have a new album that's coming out, I think, possibly the same day as my book. And Ira plays on it. And so
very cool. And what is it about George and Ira that has allowed them to be married this long and to be in a band together?
Well, you know, I mean, there are certainly others. So I guess, you know, Kim and Thurston and Sonic Youth are sort of questionable whether or not they're going to be in a band. They just broke up as a couple. But, you know, I think there's a lot about George and Ira that really allows them to separate their coupledom from being in a band. They weren't, the impression that I get was that they weren't practicing, 24/7, as they had kind of an allotted time to practice and an allotted time to be a band. And then they also had an allotted time to do their own thing and just, be a couple and go to the movies and do whatever it is that they, want to do. And a lot of that would often involve going to see rock shows and stuff like that. but I think they really were able to keep those things separate and still are. And I think that's a pretty amazing thing. They're both very cool-headed people, and I think that has a lot to do with it.
And as we mentioned up top, this really is also a history of indie rock. How do you define indie rock then and now? Is it different?
Yes and no. One of the arguments that I hope I make throughout, I think I make throughout, is that the idea of independence is different from necessarily from the idea of indie rock, where there are always people who are going to be independent-minded and free thinkers who make rock and roll music. And to me, that's a really, really important point. And in the late 70s and early 80s and going on through now, that has resulted in what we think of as indie rock, which is, a name that can be applied to all these different things: college rock, alternative rock. It's been known by all kinds of things over the years, where that is a specific lineage that comes out of people who loved the Velvet Underground and Big Star and bands like that, and worked with labels that sent their records out through independent record distributors in the early 80s and were involved in the fanzine scene and college radio. So that's like one lineage of indie rock. And that specific lineage has gotten a lot different in the last few years, especially with sort of the explosion of social media and kind of the collapse of the major labels. Everybody is indie rock in that way. And in some regards, it's lost a little bit of its luster and a little bit of its meaning, just because, anybody can start their own label or just put their MP3s up online. But to me, the idea of independence and really thinking through the reasons why you do things and inventing new ways to get your music out there or whatever is, to me, more important than any sort of Catholic notion of indie rock. And I think that's one thing that is the same over the years.
There's a quote here I want to read in the book, because I think this is great. Would you mind holding this for a minute? My hands are sweaty, though. And it is from Ira, and it says, "We don't ever want to do things just because an alarm clock goes off and it's time to make a record. We want to feel like we're doing something smart at the right time." So a lot of things go into thinking about that. It's hard to know what to make of this world.
Right. That was specifically in response to talking about kind of Yo La Tengo's immediate future. That quote is from sort of near the end of the book. And I think that really does get a lot of Ira's character in a nutshell. I think kind of if there's one word to describe him, it's thoughtful in a very literal way. And I think that reflects in a lot of the decisions Yo La Tengo have made over the years, just off going from Fake Book, which is an acoustic album, to then going out on the road and making really noisy guitar jams when people were expecting folk music. It's kind of sort of every time there was a decision for them to make, they would try not to have they would try not to make it by some kind of default. They would try to really think through why something was, the thing to do at that time. And that has resulted in career choices, that has resulted in kind of individual decisions that they were making while making records. Do we put a pedal steel on this track? Do we ask someone to come guest on it? And it manifests itself in every single possible way I can, think of in terms of the way Yo La Tengo's career has developed. And
if you had been Yo La Tengo's manager back in the day, would you have done anything differently? And do you think they would have taken your advice?
I don't think they would have taken my advice. I think I probably would have quit pretty quickly. So, I mean, they're cool-headed, but they're also strong, strong-opinioned people. They didn't have a manager for a really long time. Their first manager was Steve Fallon, who's the owner of Maxwell's, who ran Coyote Records, which was the first label that they were on. And he was their manager because he was kind of he was around, and he was their friend. And they sort of, dallied with management over the course of the years. And none of them really stuck. And, by the early 90s, they were just, they had Ira's brother manage them for a minute, and they eventually just managed themselves. And they are, they're smart enough to do that. They've got enough energy and, time to do that. And I think they've done it pretty well.
Yeah. Well, the book is awesome, Jesse. Big day coming, Yo La Tengo and the rise of indie rock. I highly recommend it. What can I tell you?